Siddhārtha Gautama was the son of the warrior king of the Shakya kingdom. His father invited an astrologer right after his birth in order to find out what fate has in store for the child. He predicted that this child would grow up either to be a powerful ruler, a king of kings, or a great saint, a founder of a new religion. His father, being a king himself, would have preferred him to become a ruler as well. What's the point of having a saint in the family after all? The child was very gifted in pretty much everything, grew up to be a great warrior, and was highly educated, very intelligent, and said to be very beautiful as well. As a prince, he had everything he could ever want in life. However, he was not allowed to leave the palace where he lived. Basically, he was not allowed to interact or even see average people and the average way of living in order to avoid him becoming a saint. For saints have compassion and empathy, they tend to feel sorry for people. Kings, on the other hand, well, not necessarily. Still, one day, since he was of curious mind, he wanted to leave to see the outside world. His father organized the whole trip very thoroughly, that he cannot see anything ugly. Only young and pretty people could be present wherever his carriage went. Everything was decorated in flowers. He wasn't meant to see any signs of poverty or any signs of misfortune. Now, believe it or not, this worked pretty well for a while. However, at some point, there was an old man. Gautama asked his coachman why he looks the way he looks. His man explained to him that when you grow really old, this is what you end up looking like. Your skin wrinkles, you become kind of weak. It's just life. Bigger shock was that it's completely inevitable. However, they continued their journey, and as they went on, soon enough he saw a disabled person. Now once again he asked his man what happened to him. Well, you know, my lord, sometimes you have an illness or an accident, and that can make you cripple for life. Needless to say, this was another huge shock for Gautama. It's not enough that you can get sick, but it might happen that you never ever recover from it and need to live the rest of your life out like that? How is this even possible? Like, why would this happen? As their journey went on, soon enough came the third and the biggest shock of all, which was a funeral procession. Now, the fact that everything that lives one day must also die. This is incomprehensible. This was incomprehensible for him. And all of these, they raised a huge question. What are you all celebrating then? Why are you all dancing? Why do you look so goddamn happy? Like, how come that this is not your absolute main focus? If you grow old, get sick and eventually die, then isn't this the main problem we would need to find a solution for? That's the only thing that matters after all. Already at this point, he started to think about the question of what is the reason behind the suffering? How does it even get there? Since no holy text ever would say that the suffering was created, every god wants something good. They all create this world in one way or another, but it's never said that they would have created the suffering on any way, any shape or form. So why does it exist? Driven by these questions, he left behind his old life, the palace, the power, all the riches, even his wife and child, and went to learn from a Samkhya master. That's where he would stay for 6 years and study Samkhya philosophy. At the end of these 6 years, he already acquired such knowledge that the master offered him to teach alongside him. However, Gautama refused, because he still didn't figure out what's the cause behind all the suffering. As it was obvious at this point that he won't find the answers there, he left to learn from a yoga master. Now, of course, this has absolutely nothing to do with what we call yoga in the West today. This was a very, very extreme ascetic practice. Eating and any kind of comfort was cut back to an absolute bare minimum, and they would do some practices that no really sane man would ever really do. For example, the 4-fire practice, where they would build 4 pieces of huge fire and the yogi would sit in the middle of that and meditate there. Now, if an average person steps between those 4 fires, they burn to ashes. No question. Actually, even today, you can find places where in monasteries they do similar practices. For example, there is the wet cloth ceremony practiced by Buddhist nuns, which means that once a year the nuns go outside into the -10, -20 degrees Celsius, start walking around the monastery with a wet cloth laid on their shoulder, and they dry the cloth. Then they take it off, put on another one, and the question essentially is how many they can dry in the -20. On their own shoulder. Maybe it's even snowing. And yeah, that's real. And you know what's even funnier? Anyone can do it as long as they master the so-called Tummo practice. Tummo, by the way, means inner heat. This actually predates Buddhism. For example, the Patanjali Yoga Sutra describes 24 so-called siddhis, which are magical abilities that can be acquired via yoga. Gautama acquired all the 24 siddhis and performed the practice called Nirbija Samadhi. This means that he was in a meditative state for 7 days without any sign of life. So he obviously didn't drink or eat, but one couldn't even tell if he was breathing. Once he came out of this state, he had to realize that even though he has reached the highest level of yoga practice, he still didn't get the answer for the main question: why does suffering exist? As said, until now, he was living a very ascetic life. One day, however, he was sitting next to a river. He saw an old man teaching a boy to play some stringed instrument. The musician was explaining to the boy that the string cannot be too loose, for then it wouldn't give any sound. But it cannot be too tight either, because then it might snap. So one needs to find the middle way where it gives a sound. This inspired Gautama and is an important aspect of Buddhism to this day. Don't overdo anything, don't go for the extreme approach. Once he realized that, he left the ascetic life behind. Of course, as soon as he did that, most of his friends and followers left from his side, saying that Gautama submitted himself to the body and the desires and therefore is not worth following. Being by himself, Gautama sat down next to a tree, but didn't just sit down, but promised himself not to stand up as long as he doesn't figure out what the reason behind the suffering is. He even cursed himself that he shall rot if he stands up before realizing the reason. So he sat down, and in 6 days he reached the enlightenment. Now, this was such a big deal that according to the legends, the whole universe made a sudden ringing sound, like a bell. And all the beings of all the 6 worlds felt this happening. Essentially, what happened is that Gautama figured out the answer to his question. However, he soon enough also realized that even if he would tell this to anyone, they will not understand, because the eyes of the beings are covered with dust. So even if he would explain it to them, it would be useless because they just couldn't comprehend it. Thankfully though, at this point the god Indra appeared to him and asked him to still teach those selected few whose eyes are only covered with a thin layer of dust. Because for those whose eyes are just slightly covered, only need the teaching to be able to see. So he gave the teaching for his 5 friends and followers, who then also reached enlightenment immediately. What did Gautama realize though? He realized that the ego and the overvaluation of the ego is the core of the problems and the root of all suffering. This is why they created a mendicant, or in other words, a begging order. For the main idea was to practice humility and humbleness. They only live from what they are given. This was the life of Buddha in a nutshell. As we can see, the main concept of which Buddhism is built around is the suffering, but not in a melancholic, depressed, self-pitying way. No, but with an open mind, with creativity. How can we make this stop? And the very first teaching he gave was meant to tackle this exact problem with the help of the 4 noble truths. But what those are, we'll see in the next video.